Emery King presents World Class Detroiters. Tonight, a legendary champion of equal justice under the law. Born nearly 85 years ago in Detroit as a child of the Great Depression, Judge Damon Keith promised his dad that he'd be the first in his family to graduate from college. And he's been keeping his promises ever since, standing up to the power of presidents, demonstrating repeatedly the courage of his convictions. Tonight, stay tuned for an inspiring behind-the-scenes look at the extraordinary life of Judge Damon Keith.
Hello, I'm Emery King with another edition of World Class Detroiters. Democracies die behind closed doors. That's a classic line from the Honorable Damon J. Keith, who has been a federal judge in this town for the past 40 years. In that time, he has worked with an unrelenting devotion to that basis for all our rights and liberties, the U.S. Constitution. Nearly every day, weather permitting, 84-year-old Judge Damon Keith takes what he calls his constitutional. Leaving his offices in the federal court building, the judge makes a 40-minute loop of downtown Detroit. His past 4 decades have been marked by a number of seminal cases, but none more important than the one that became known as the Keith decision. Judge, in the Keith case, you had to tell the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and the Attorney General, John Mitchell, to stop doing what they were already doing. Tell us about that.
This is why this Keith case was so important, because Mitchell could say to you or your wife or to anybody, I want unilaterally to wiretap every phone conversation you make because you're a threat to national security. He had that power to do that. And I said, you can't do that. You've got to go, you got to show probable cause. You've got to go to a magistrate or a judge and say, Emery King and his wife, based on the probable cause that I have, are a threat to the national security of our country. And we want to wiretap them. But before they could do it unilaterally.
The year was 1971, and the case, the U.S. versus Sinclair, involved a bug placed by the government in the offices of the White Panthers, a scruffy group of self-styled revolutionaries reviled by most Americans. Nixon was at the height of his popularity with a 60% approval rating, and, like all modern presidents before him, claimed the right to do electronic surveillance without a warrant in national security cases. Nonetheless, Judge Keith told Nixon and Mitchell, no, you need to get a warrant.
And when I saw the wiretaps, they had lied. There was not one thing in the wiretaps dealing with national security.
Just recently, the issue has come up again, with President George W. Bush claiming the same kind of executive power. Judge Keith says the Constitution always needs defending.
That's what they taught me at Howard University Law School. I can hear Thurgood Marshall saying now, the white man said equal justice under law. The white man wrote the Declaration of Independence. Let's make them live up to it at Howard University Law School.
But the young man who was born Damon J. Keith on the 4th of July, 1922, walked a long, lesson-filled road before he ever got to law school at Howard. A vital figure in his life, his dad, Perry Keith, told the boy, walk like you're proud of yourself, because I'm proud of you.
He came up here from Georgia, and Henry Ford was offering $5 a day, and he left my mother and my brothers and sisters in Atlanta. Once he got a job, he sent for them, and then I was born here in Detroit.
For most of his first 2 decades, young Damon's only real role model was his dad.
I went from the kindergarten all the way through high school, Columbian Elementary School, McMichael Intermediate, Northwestern High School, and never had a black teacher.
Back in those days, separate but equal was the law of the land. Racism and segregation could be found just about anywhere, even the local YMCA.
The Fisher Y was right across from Northwestern High School. No blacks could go to the Fisher Y.
In the midst of the Great Depression, Perry Keith was a strong advocate of the importance of education.
My father was very sick with pneumonia, and we thought he was going to die. And my mother walked off the porch and said, Damon, your father wants to talk to you. And this is an emotional experience for me. So I went up to see my dad, and he said, son, none of my children have finished college. and I want you to finish. And he said, I hope God will spare me. So, miraculously, he got well. Unbelievable.
Damon's mom, Annie Louise, was related to the wife of the president of an all-black college.
And so I went to West Virginia State College, and for the first time, I saw black PhDs, a black president, John W. Davis, who was absolutely brilliant. And he would bring in these blacks from around the country, like Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, Benjamin Mays, Charles Hamilton Houston. And for the first time, I started seeing blacks in a different light.
And the inspired young man never forgot his promise to his dad.
And as we were walking around the college, he says, Damon, I have seen you graduate from college, and God has kept his commitment to me, and I'm ready to go. I said, Dad, cut it out. And I came home, and my dad and my mother greeted me, and I remember so well, I hugged my dad and said, I'm going to this party. One of my classmates or friends were going to the Army. And I came back late that night, and the next morning my father got sick and died.
But he saw you graduate from college.
And that continues to drive me not to let him down and to keep the commitment that he made to God, and God took care of him.
When we come back, Damon Keith marches off to war, journeys to law school, and returns to Detroit to meet the love of his life. When young Damon Keith graduated from West Virginia State College, the world was at war. It was 1943, and the U.S. Army, reflecting the society it was fighting for, was deeply segregated.
I went into an all-black unit. I had a white CEO, white lieutenants, and it was such a demeaning experience to me to be subjected to whites with less training, I think, and less ability than I had, and taking orders from them in an army where we're fighting for justice and equality and fighting against Hitler and the Nazis.
The war was over 3 years later, and Damon was ready to forge a career. An Army buddy who had gone to law school had some advice.
He said, well, Damon, you have some fire in your belly. I think you should go to law school. And through the law, we may be able to correct this thing. And that was the bug that led me to law.
Haven't seen you at the market lately.
I was there last Saturday.
I missed you.
All right.
Here now.
Accepted at the University of Detroit Law School, he got more advice from one of his college mentors, West Virginia State President John Davis.
And he says, Damon, the way you feel, you should go to Howard University's law school. Because if you want to correct these inequities legally, they have a think tank down there, some of the great black legal minds in the country.
So it was off to Howard Law School and a chance to learn from giants like Thurgood Marshall.
Well, he had a tremendous influence on me. And I can remember as a student at Howard, at the moot court, watching Thurgood and Charlie Houston arguing cases before the students. And then we would go up to the Supreme Court later on to hear them arguing the same cases. And to watch Thurgood and Charlie Houston, those giants, arguing these cases before the United States with dignity and intellectual wealth and support, just made you feel proud.
But returning to Detroit as a young black lawyer in the late 40s and 50s was a very different experience.
When I started practicing law, there wasn't a black judge in the state of Michigan. All the black lawyers basically were in the Tobin building. And there were no black law firms west of Woodward.
Judge, what was it like in those early years as a lawyer, a black lawyer in Detroit? And what was it like dealing with those white judges?
It's awful. And not only all white judges, the few black lawyers we had, 2/3 of them worked in the post office at night and practiced law during the day. And when I say practice law, they would sit in the jury box and wait for judges to give them assignments, the white judges.
It was about this time that a friend who was a surgeon at Detroit Receiving Hospital introduced Damon to another doctor doing a residency in internal medicine.
So Malcolm said, Damon, there's a lady over here who I'd like for you to meet. If I were single, she's the type of woman I'd like to marry. He says, do you have any hang-ups with professional black women? Do they give you an inferiority complex? I said, no, man, what are you talking about? They give me an inferiority complex.
So Damon Keith met Rachel Boone.
I knew instantly that something had clicked. I asked her out to a football game. That was our first date. And I'm a football fanatic, professional football. And the Detroit Lions were playing the Los Angeles Dons. And Rachel started pulling for the Detroit Lions. And I said, now, darling, let's get this straight. I'm not pulling for the Detroit Lions. They don't have any black football players on their team. I said, I'm pulling for the Los Angeles Dons. And the Dons had 2 or 3 blacks on their team. And Rachel has said after that I knew where my husband stood on this civil rights issue, and I didn't make that same mistake again.
Coming next, some of Judge Keith's most important cases. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education overturned the separate but equal policy in education. The case was argued by the great Thurgood Marshall, later to be named the first black justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. A year later, Rosa Parks was arrested on that bus in Montgomery, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. seized the moment. The civil rights movement was on the march, and in Detroit, young Damon Keith was building his law career. After 4 years as the first black attorney with the Wayne County Friend of the Court, Damon joined one of the city's top black law firms. In 1964, he started his own practice, representing a number of large black businesses. At the same time, he was serving on numerous boards and commissions, working tirelessly for civil rights and for the Democratic Party. In 1967, the year the city erupted with one of the nation's worst civil disturbances, President Lyndon Johnson appointed Damon Keith to the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. Before long, the new judge would confront a series of tough and important cases. In Davis versus the Pontiac School District in 1970, feelings ran hot when he ruled on whether the Pontiac School Board should be required to alleviate pre-existing segregation by busing students. There was a march on Washington. 10 buses were bombed, and the FBI reported threats on the judge's life.
The marshals had to circle my house for a long time, and I never told Rachel that my life allegedly was in danger, but she said she knew there were strange cars circling my house on Outer Drive where we lived.
But to Judge Keith, the ruling on the responsibility of the Pontiac School Board was clear.
They were responsible for the school system being segregated up there. The black teachers were in black schools, the white teachers were in white schools. There was very little integration, if any.
In 1973, the issue was whether Detroit Edison was discriminating against blacks in its hiring policies.
We found out that blacks were categorized into certain jobs. They were mopping floors or driving cars for the white executives, doing no desk work, no supervisors. They were completely segregated with demeaning, low-paying jobs.
Judge Keith levied fines in the millions against Edison and the union involved.
And this tore my heart apart. I found out that the union, in collaboration with management, were a part of the conspiracy to keep blacks down.
And the judge's ruling changed for good the hiring practices at Detroit Edison.
I ordered Detroit Edison to immediately start hiring blacks and putting them in positions of responsibility, making them vice presidents and putting them in top management positions.
But the judge's signature case remains the one that is known as the Keith decision, a ruling that even President Nixon needed a warrant for wiretaps.
The case was originally assigned to Judge Talbot Smith on the blind draw. And Talbot Smith lived in Ann Arbor, and the CIA building that was allegedly dynamited was in Ann Arbor. So Judge Talbot Smith, at our judges meeting on the first Monday in the month, said to Judge Freeman, said, look, I live up there, and I am frightened for my wife and my family, and I think we should call the chief judge in Cincinnati and have him send in an outside judge to try this case.
But Damon Keith argued they should not give up a case just because it might be difficult.
And Judge Freeman said, I think you're right, Damon. And he said, well, let's put all of the names in our hat right at this meeting and leave Judge Talbot Smith's name out. And all the judges agreed. And whoever's name is pulled out will be the judge who will try this case.
And that's how you got that case.
And that's exactly how I got this case. And Emory, I think I've never discussed this incident with anybody public, and you got this out of me tonight, but it shows you the little things that happen.
Over the years, Judge Keith has presided over his courtroom with such fairness and grace that he has never been forced to find anyone in contempt of court. In 1976, after a remarkable string of important cases, President Jimmy Carter raised Damon Keith to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, based in Cincinnati. After 30 years, he still travels there for deliberation. When we come back, the judge says no to another president. Judge Keith and his family lived for 43 years in the same house on Outer Drive and Prairie on Detroit's west side. All three of their accomplished daughters were raised there. On January 4th of this year, Dr. Rachel Keith passed away suddenly at the age of 82.
God gave my wife and me 53 years of marriage, 3 wonderful daughters and 2 wonderful granddaughters. And we had 53 years, so I look at that as a blessing.
Appointed to the federal bench for life and heading for his 85th birthday in July, the judge still puts in a full day's work that always begins the same way.
Every morning I read the Bible, the Proverbs, and have meditation and thank God for his goodness to me and how he's just, in spite of all the turbulence in my life, he's taking good care of me. And I know my whole life is in his hands.
Saying no to power is never easy, but the judge felt he needed to do it again in 2002 in the Free Press versus Ashcroft case. President Bush and his Attorney General John Ashcroft had made it administration policy to hold deportation hearings against alleged terrorists in secret. In rejecting this policy, Judge Keith penned the words that became an almost instant classic: democracies die behind closed doors.
I feel very strongly about this constitutionally, that we have to open up. We can't have these immigration trials without an open hearing. The lawyers and family, we can't do this. We can't trust this to the immigration judges.
On his walks around downtown, the judge often thinks about the changes he's seen in his city.
I feel very proud of where the city is. I think Mayor Kilpatrick is doing a great job. When you think about 1950, when I came, there were no black elected officials and no opportunities for blacks in the city.
Judge Keith has hired more minorities and women as law clerks than any other federal judge. In making his choices, he always looks beyond academic records, and he often cites Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm as an example.
She finished Harvard Law, Phi Beta Kappa, But I saw something else in her, in addition to those outstanding academic requirements. She had a commitment to equal justice under law and the Constitution. She had a background of helping others.
For more than 30 years, there's been a Damon J. Keith Elementary School in Detroit. And over the past 3 decades, the judge has been vitally active in our community, co-founding the NAACP Freedom Fund Dinner, developing a celebration of civil rights called Marching Toward Justice, and organizing the National Farewell for Rosa Parks. The walls of his chambers hold a massive collection of honors and awards. In 1993, Wayne State University established the Damon J. Keith Law Collection of African American legal history, and the campus will soon hold a new building named the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. And his office corridors are covered with more than 40 years' worth of photos of the judge with celebrated leaders of government, industry, and the arts.
Judge, how much longer will you do this?
Well, I don't know how, that's up to God, but I told my wife and my children and my staff that if they see me missing a beat or becoming senile or not performing at a level that I should be performing at, let me know and I'll walk away from the court. So in answer to your question, I'll stay as long as I can still function.
I don't think you're missing any beats here.
I hope not.
So there you have Judge Damon Keith, obviously one of my personal heroes, a man justly proud and remarkably humble. Clearly, we all owe the judge our deep gratitude for his courage, vigilance, and devotion to constitutional justice and our precious civil rights. His long, wonderful life serves as both a lesson and an inspiration to all of us. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Emery King.